this is the problem of the crypto community. They're fixated upon a prototypical coin network that's a lab experiment, and they're comparing it to Bitcoin instead of comparing Bitcoin to actual monetary or asset networks in the real world. So for example, here's a real asset network. It's called real estate. I have $100 trillion of real estate. You have a house. Let's say you have $1 million house. You want to hold, this is a good example. Let's assume that real estate is my energy network. If you want to actually carry a $1 million house 100 years, in Florida, there's a 2% real estate tax. You would pay $20,000 a year every year for 100 years, assuming that the house was capped and not reappraised. And so you're in essence going to lose the house in 50 years, right? Under the best of circumstances, you're going to lose all your wealth in about 20 years if you store your wealth or you store your monetary energy in a real estate network in Florida. So if you go to any other real estate jurisdiction, they've all got different tax rates over time. But this is why you can't really store energy in property, because the tax rate generally will bleed you out with somewhere between 20 years and 100 years. Now, that's the inflation rate or the energy loss rate over time. What about over space? What if you want to transfer $1 million house? What if I want to buy it from you? So you want to exchange energy exchange. You want to exchange the energy in the house? Well, it's a 6% transaction fee. And at the point that I said, Robert, I want to buy your house, I'll give you $1 million for it. How many days to closing? 30? Probably 30.
Best case.
Okay, so you just paid $60,000 and waited a month in order to do your transaction. Now compare that to Bitcoin again. Right? 30 minutes, $6, 30 days, $60,000. This is why we don't use property as an energy network. By the way, some people do. You could ask people point blank, how are you going to actually give your money to your granddaughter? Oh, I'm going to buy property. Buy it where? California? Florida? Where? It's the same counterparty rate. By the way, it's worse than gold.
Yeah.
You can move 3,000 pounds of gold in 30 days for $150,000, $200,000. You can't move $100 million worth of property in 30 days to another country.
And you're also taking the counterparty risk again. The other thing with property is that it's non-fungible, right? So the liquidity of the market is much smaller than, say, gold or Bitcoin. And you run the risk of that area having some natural disaster or some other event that makes it uninhabitable or unappealing.
It's illiquid, right? It could take you 3 years to sell the house.
That's right.
It'll take you 3 years to find a counterparty. It'll take you 30 days to do the transaction. Now, we just come back to this fee, right? What are the transaction fees on the Visa network? What are the transaction fees across any monetary network? It's pretty routine to pay 1%, 2%, 3% to move something around. If Bitcoin gets to be $100 trillion and there's 1% transaction fees, it's going to be 10. Well, pick any number, multiply by 1%, right? It's $1 trillion a year in transaction fees. Nothing wrong with that. What's the entire size of what the spreads are in the bond industry? Like, I used to buy and sell convertible debt. There were 200 basis point spreads. You could buy at 96. And so you could buy at 98. You could sell at 96. The banks got in between.
Right. Yeah.
So all of the financial system is built on taking a spread. That's why New York City has tall buildings.
Right.
We talked about this before. We talked wherever there's a node in a network, a railhead. I mean, Venice, Paris, London, New York. Wherever there's a node in a central network where there's exchange, there's a transaction fee, and if you're lucky, it's only 1% or 2%. Mm-hmm. When you're unlucky, I mean, there's a reason people refer to free ports. Free port meant that when you pull your ship into the port, we weren't going to steal it all. Like, but you know what the great breakthrough is in Singapore? Here's the breakthrough. We're going to have a port in the middle of the Pacific where if a ship comes into our port, we don't take all their cargo, or we don't take 10% of their cargo. That's your idea? Yeah, that's my idea. We're going to let them stop here and not seize 10% of their stuff. Wow, that's a brilliant idea. By the way, that's such a unique concept that Singapore is Singapore. It is the greatest port in all the Pacific because it's so rare that a country agrees not to take 3% of what you have when you stop. By the way, you can't even come into the United States without filling out a customs form where they charge you a 10% duty on whatever you have in your possession. The point, it's very common to take 10% of what you have when you come and when you leave. Right. That's why those cities are cities. That's why those empires are empires. So when someone sits around and they whine about $5 in transaction fees is too great, they're whining because it's more expensive than their laboratory experiment on their scientific workbench that no one's using.
Right.
Yeah, I can conceptualize hypothetically in my perfect world, a perfect system where it was better. But the real world is $100 trillion worth of real estate and $250 trillion worth of bonds and stocks and gold and silver and other property. And that stuff's moving around with transaction fees, which are high enough to have paid for all the buildings in London, Paris, New York, San Francisco, Beijing, Tokyo, Venice, and Rome. It's not a new idea to charge transaction fees. It's not a problem. And the beauty of Bitcoin is as more miners come on, they create a very competitive industry. And if a miner charges too much transaction fees, someone else is going to drive the cost of transaction fees down. And if the revenue from transaction fees falls below the variable cost of running the mining rigs, people are going to take mining rigs out of production eventually, unless a government wants to subsidize them, in which case a government's going to be subsidizing the crypto rails, which create the 21st century economy. And that's by the way, that's a reason why mining is a bit riskier as a business than owning Bitcoin. Right? Because you're getting into a commodity business where you may get driven down to the variable cost of the electricity or below the variable cost of the electricity if someone else wants to get into the business, and they can. And it's good for Bitcoin. It's good for everything built above the chain, right? Caveat emptor if you want to get into the commodity or the business of encrypted energy. Go ahead.
I think that's a great point too, that you bring up. The transaction fees on the Bitcoin network are set at fair market value, right? It is a freely competitive industry such that all of the transaction fees are a consensual exchange. And the value paid in those transaction fees goes, with very little loss directly to supporting the security of the network. Whereas ostensibly these government fees that are, they're non-consensual, they're conducted under, a monopolized area. A lot of that value being extracted 10% in, 10% out is not going to securing the property rights that you're bringing in and out, right? It's a very small piece of that. Most of it's going into political coffers.
And politicians, they don't even hide that. They'll say, we've just decided to tax this in order to pay for something unrelated.
Exactly.